Fugitive finds badly wounded cop on rural highway. But when she helps her, she uncovers a secret that shocks everyone. Comment giving a score from 0 to 10 for my story. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The rural highway stretched like an open wound across the parched earth, and the 30-year-old woman ran, her bare feet bleeding with each step. The afternoon sun beat down on her sunburnt skin, and sweat mixed with dust formed crusts on her gaunt face. She'd been on the run for 14 months, ever since that terrible day she was convicted of a crime she never committed. Her lungs burned, but fear kept her moving, always moving, because stopping meant getting caught and forever losing the chance to see her daughter again. That's when she saw the body lying on the shoulder of the road. At first, she thought about swerving and continuing to run, but something made her stop. The blue uniform stained with bright red shone under the merciless sun. The patrol car was overturned a few yards ahead, its door crumpled and shattered glass scattered across the hot ground. The fallen woman wore the uniform that represented everything she'd learned to fear and hate during the past months of desperate flight. The injured person was a woman of approximately 30, with delicate features that seemed to belong to another world, far removed from this brutal reality. Her face had a striking, almost unreal beauty, as if she had stepped out of some magazine. But now it was pale and covered in cold sweat. A deep wound in her right leg bled profusely, staining the dry earth a dark, viscous red. The fugitive stood trembling, torn between the instinct for survival and something deeper that pulsed in her chest. That woman in uniform could be her enemy, could be one of the people who hunted her day and night, but at that moment she was just a person suffering, vulnerable and alone. The wrecked radio lay a few feet away, useless and silent. She approached slowly, her dirty hands trembling. The injured woman opened her green eyes for a moment, mumbled something incomprehensible, and fainted again. The fugitive looked around, making sure they were alone on that desolate road, and made a decision that would change everything. With trembling fingers, she tore pieces from her own dirty, sweat-soaked shirt to make a makeshift bandage. The thin fabric wasn't ideal, but it was all she had. She tightened the tourniquet above the wound, trying to remember the basic first aid instructions she'd learned years ago in a life that seemed to belong to someone else. Carrying the injured woman was a challenge that almost defeated her. Her thin body, weakened by months of meager food and constant flight, protested with every step. The muscles in her arms burned, her back screamed in pain, but she continued dragging that weight to an abandoned building she'd spotted a few yards from the road. The place was little more than 4 bare walls and a roof full of holes, but it offered shade and shelter. The fugitive laid the injured woman on the cracked concrete floor and allowed herself to fall beside her, panting and exhausted. Her feet were bleeding intensely now, leaving red marks on the grey floor. During the night, fever began to consume the injured woman. Her body trembled violently, and she mumbled disjointed words in her delirium. The fugitive had no medicine, no clean water, nothing but her empty hands and a compassion she thought she'd lost long ago. She went out into the darkness, risking everything, and found rusty cans in the trash scattered around the building. When the rain began to fall in the middle of the night, she positioned the cans to collect every precious drop. The water tasted of rust and dirt, but it was water. On the second day, the fugitive searched for edible roots in the dry brush around. Her hands bled as she dug in the hard earth, but she managed to find some bitter roots that she chewed slowly before offering small pieces to the injured woman who could barely swallow. She kept cold compresses on her forehead burning with fever, repeatedly wetting the rags in rainwater. During these terrible days, the fugitive found herself thinking about her 4-year-old daughter she'd left behind. The girl was with her sister in a distant city, growing up without her mother and probably believing she'd been abandoned. The pain of this separation was physical. a hole in her chest that never healed, that pulsed with every heartbeat. The false accusation of theft had destroyed everything. The manipulated evidence, the witnesses who lied under pressure, the judge who wouldn't listen to her version of the facts. She remembered the day of the sentencing, the cold handcuffs on her wrists, the judgmental eyes of people who didn't know her but had already condemned her. The prison break hadn't been planned. It had just happened during a chaotic transfer, and since then she'd lived like a hunted animal, always running, always afraid. On the fourth day, the injured woman finally opened her eyes completely. Her confused expression wandered around the dirty, destroyed environment until it landed on the thin, dirty figure watching her from a corner. Her first words were a weak, broken whisper. "Sorry." The fugitive didn't understand. Sorry for what? For being injured, for representing everything that tormented her. The word seemed strange, out of place, meaningless in that context. She didn't answer, just offered a little water in a crushed can. And the injured woman drank avidly, coughing a little when she swallowed too quickly. During the next 2 weeks, a strange routine was established in that makeshift hideout. Recovery was painful and slow, punctuated by moments of high fever and delirium, interspersed with periods of increasing lucidity. The fugitive hunted for food in the surrounding area, always alert for any sign of movement on the distant road, always ready to run again, if necessary. It was during one of these moments of lucidity, when the pain in her leg seemed less unbearable, that the injured woman began to speak. Her voice was hoarse, broken by suffering, but there was a determination in it that caught the fugitive's attention. "I was investigating something," she said, her green eyes fixed on the cracked ceiling. "Alone. I couldn't trust anyone at the precinct." The fugitive felt a chill down her spine. Precinct. That word carried so much weight, so much accumulated fear. The injured woman continued, between pauses, to take deep breaths and control the pain. "I discovered that the sheriff was manipulating evidence, arresting innocent people to protect the real criminals, people who were paying fat bribes to continue operating freely." The fugitive's world seemed to spin. Her hands began to tremble uncontrollably, and she needed to lean against the bare wall to avoid falling. The injured woman's words echoed in her mind, connecting to painful memories, to injustices she'd experienced firsthand. "The sheriff," the fugitive managed to whisper, her voice broken by emotion. "He was the one who fabricated the evidence against me." The green eyes widened, and the injured woman tried to sit up, moaning in pain with the sudden movement. "You were framed by him. Convicted for a robbery I never committed. I lost my daughter. I lost everything." The silence that followed was dense, laden with meaning and shared pain. The injured woman closed her eyes, and tears streamed down her dirty face. When she spoke again, her voice was even lower, almost inaudible. "I had evidence, documents, recordings, everything hidden in my house, but I think he discovered my investigation. The accident wasn't an accident. I was being followed that morning, I'm sure of it now." The fugitive felt something strange growing in her chest. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was something close to it, a possibility. A tiny chance that maybe, just maybe, the truth could come out. "If we can recover that evidence," she said slowly, "could you prove my innocence too?" The injured woman opened her eyes and looked at her directly. There was pain in that look, but also a steely determination that contrasted with the fragility of her wounded body. "I can try, if the evidence still exists." That night, as the rain began to fall again and drip through the holes in the roof, the two women began to plan. The wound in her leg was still serious, but was beginning to show signs of healing. They would need another week, maybe 2, before she could walk longer distances. The fugitive watched the injured woman sleep restlessly, her face contorted with pain even in her sleep, and wondered if she was crazy to trust someone who wore that uniform. But then she thought of her 4-year-old daughter, of the child's big, frightened eyes when they took her away, and she knew she had to try. Even if it was a trap, even if it ended up worse than it was, she needed to try to get her life and her daughter back. What she didn't know yet was that the sheriff had already discovered the injured woman's disappearance and that men were looking for her at that very moment, searching every abandoned building, every possible hideout, in a search that was getting dangerously close to that precarious refuge. When the injured woman was finally able to stand with support, 19 days had passed since the accident. Her leg still ached intensely, but she could walk with a limp, leaning on the fugitive who held her by the waist. They set off at dawn, when the fog still covered the rural highway and concealed their movements. The journey to the nearest town took 3 exhausting days. They hid during the day, taking advantage of farmers' wagons that passed along the highway when luck allowed, and sleeping in abandoned barns when night fell. The fugitive was always alert, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon for patrol cars or uniforms that could mean the end of her freedom. The injured woman shared stories during rest stops. She told about the 8 months of silent investigation, about how she discovered the irregularities by chance while reviewing old files, about the growing fear that someone would notice her searches in the internal systems of the precinct. She mentioned names of other officers involved, amounts of bribes, manipulated cases that accumulated like a house of cards about to collapse. "I had everything organized," she said, with a voice full of frustration. "Every document copied, every conversation secretly recorded. I was waiting for the right moment to hand everything over to the district attorney in the state capital, but I was cowardly. I waited too long." The fugitive understood that fear, understand the weight of facing a corrupt system, of putting yourself against people with power and influence. She herself had tried to prove her innocence in the beginning, but her words were ignored, her evidence discarded, her witnesses silenced. When they finally arrived in town, hiding behind a cart loaded with vegetables, the fugitive's heart pounded as she saw the busy streets, the people walking freely, the open shops with their colorful windows. It had been so long since she'd seen a real town, since she'd walked among normal people living normal lives. The injured woman indicated the direction of her house with a discreet gesture. They needed to wait for nightfall to approach, moving through the shadows like ghosts. What they found made the fugitive's stomach churn. The house was destroyed. The exterior walls had black smoke stains, the windows were broken, and the smell of ashes still permeated the air. Curious neighbors gathered in small groups on the sidewalks, talking in low voices and pointing to the rubble. The injured woman collapsed right there, her knees giving way on the rough sidewalk. Tears flowed silently down her face as she stared at what was left of her life. The fugitive held her by the shoulders, preventing her from falling completely, feeling the pain of that woman as if it were her own. They moved away quickly when they realized they were attracting curious glances. They found shelter in a narrow alley between 2 commercial buildings where they crouched among cardboard boxes and accumulated garbage. The injured woman sobbed softly, her hands covering her face. "It's over," she murmured. 8 months of work, all the evidence, all lost. The fugitive felt the last spark of hope extinguish in her chest. She had risked so much, trusted so much, and now it all seemed to have been in vain. Her daughter would continue growing up without her, believing that her mother was a criminal, a bad person who deserved to be away. They spent that night in the alley, trembling with cold and despair. At dawn, hunger forced them to move. The injured woman suggested that they look for food scraps near the municipal market. And it was during this desperate search that something unexpected happened. They were in the central square, the fugitive hidden behind a fruit stand, while the injured woman examined some fallen oranges on the ground, when a female voice called her name. "I thought you were dead." The woman approaching was about 30 years old, wore a uniform identical to the one the injured woman had worn on the day of the accident, and her face showed genuine shock. The fugitive cowered even further behind the stand, her heart pounding in her chest. The injured woman stood paralyzed, clearly torn between fleeing and facing the situation. The co-worker approached closer, lowering her voice to an urgent whisper. "The sheriff said you had a serious accident and needed to travel for treatment in another state. But the rumors at the precinct are different. People are talking, suspicious. And there's more. A federal investigation is coming to the area. No one knows exactly when, but it's causing panic." The injured woman grabbed her co-worker's arm with desperate force. "Did you see anything strange after my disappearance? Anything out of the ordinary?" The co-worker looked around nervously before answering. "Uniformed men went to your house days after the accident. I heard they searched everything before the fire. And there's something else." She hesitated, biting her lower lip. "I found an envelope on my desk a week ago. It was sealed, had your name written on it, but had no sender. I was afraid to open it. I thought it might be a trap. I kept it at home." The injured woman's expression changed completely. Her eyes widened, and she squeezed her co-worker's arm even tighter. "I sent copies by mail weeks before the accident. I only used initials for identification. I was afraid something would happen to me." The fugitive, still hidden, felt something ignite again in her chest. It was small, fragile, but it was there. A possibility. That same night, the three women met at a cheap motel on the edge of town. The room had peeling walls, a creaking bed, and smelled of mildew, but it offered privacy. The co-worker handed over the thick envelope with trembling hands. The injured woman tore the seal with eager fingers, and dozens of sheets fell onto the stained bed. They were copies of official documents, transcripts of conversations, photographs of suspicious bank transfers. It was all there. Not everything she had, but enough. Enough to prove the systemic corruption. The fugitive approached slowly and saw her name among the papers. There was an entire file dedicated to her case, with handwritten notes by the injured woman, highlighting inconsistencies in the process, pointing out witnesses who were clearly coerced, showing how the evidence against her didn't make sense when analyzed carefully. The tears came without warning. She collapsed right there, on the dirty floor of the cheap room, sobbing so violently that her whole body trembled. Someone had seen, someone had noticed the injustice. Someone had cared enough to document everything. The injured woman knelt beside her, ignoring the pain in her leg, and hugged her. The two stayed there, holding each other, crying for the accumulated pain of so long, for the weight of carrying injustices that no one else seemed to see. The co-worker watched uncomfortably, wringing her hands nervously. "What are you going to do now?" The injured woman wiped away her tears with the back of her dirty hand. "We need to get this to the district attorney in the state capital before the sheriff can skip town for good." They left the next morning on an old, noisy Greyhound bus that took a whole day to make the trip. The fugitive sat in the back, the hood of a borrowed jacket covering her face, watching through the fogged window the landscape she hadn't seen for over a year. Green fields, small houses, children playing by the roadsides. Life happening while hers was frozen in an endless injustice. The injured woman sat beside her, the thick envelope pressed against her chest as if it were the most precious object in the world. And perhaps it was. Those sheets represented the chance for redemption, for justice, to rebuild shattered lives. When they arrived in the state capital, it was already night. The big city swallowed them with its lights, its tall buildings, its constant movement of cars and people. The district attorney's office was closed, wouldn't open until Monday because of the long weekend. The co-worker had returned to the small town, promising to keep silent. The two women needed to hide for 3 whole days. It was the injured woman who suggested the homeless shelter, a place where no one asked questions, where forgotten faces blended in without attracting attention. The shelter was a large warehouse converted into a communal dormitory. Dozens of rusty metal bunk beds lined up in tight rows, the thin, stained mattresses offering little comfort. The air was heavy with the smell of dirty bodies, reheated food, and cheap disinfectant. But there was a roof, there were walls, there was soup served in cracked plastic bowls. The injured woman, who had always lived with some comfort, seemed lost in that environment. Her green eyes scanned the place with a mixture of shock and guilt, as if she finally understood the reality that so many lived daily. The fugitive knew that kind of place well, had been through several during her escape, and the sad familiarity helped her move more easily among the other forgotten ones. That night, lying on tight bunk beds that creaked with every movement, the injured woman whispered in the dark, "I never knew. I never really understood what it meant to have nothing, to have no one." The fugitive didn't respond immediately. After a long silence, she said, "Now you know. And when this is all over, you'll never forget. This will change you." The 3 days of waiting seemed to last an eternity. They shared the thin soup with others who had no choice, slept surrounded by muffled coughs and cries, washed their faces in rusty sinks with cold water. And throughout all this time, the envelope with the evidence never left her side, always hidden under her clothes, always protected. When Monday finally arrived, they left the shelter at dawn. The district attorney's office opened at 8, and they were at the door at 7:30, waiting with an anxiety that made their stomachs churn. The DA who received them was a young woman, perhaps just over 30, with a serious appearance and penetrating gaze. She listened to the story with a neutral expression, but as she examined the documents spread out on her desk, her expression gradually changed, becoming increasingly serious and concerned. The DA spent more than 2 hours analyzing each document with meticulous attention. Her hands moved the papers carefully, her eyes scanned each line, each note, each piece of systematically organized evidence of corruption. The silence in the room was dense, broken only by the sound of pages being turned and the anxious breathing of the 2 women who were waiting. Finally, the DA looked up, and her face showed a disturbing seriousness. "I received anonymous complaints about irregularities at that precinct a few months ago, but I never had anything concrete enough to act. This changes everything." She explained that the federal investigation mentioned was just beginning, without clear direction, without knowing where to start. The evidence that the injured woman had collected during 8 months of silent work offered a complete map of the corruption, showing a pattern that spanned 5 uninterrupted years. The DA pointed to specific documents. "It's not just the sheriff. There are 3 other officers directly involved. They were accepting bribes from local business owners to ignore illegal operations and, even worse, were arresting innocent competitors of those payers. They created false charges, manipulated evidence, coerced witnesses." The fugitive felt her hands tremble when the DA picked up the file with her case. "Yours is particularly serious. All the evidence against you was fabricated. The witnesses admitted in other depositions recorded here that they were pressured to lie under threat of arrest for crimes they had actually committed. You were a pawn." The floor seemed to disappear beneath the fugitive's feet. She had always known she was innocent, but seeing it documented, proven, recorded on official paper was different. It was real in a way that her solitary suffering had never managed to be. The injured woman leaned forward, her voice hoarse with emotion. "How many cases are there like hers?" The DA turned pages, counting mentally. "From what I'm seeing here, 17. 17 people wrongfully convicted over 5 years. Some are still in prison, others have already served their sentences and moved on carrying the mark of criminals. 17 lives destroyed. 17 families shattered, 17 injustices that no one had questioned because the system seemed to work perfectly on the surface." The fugitive thought of her daughter, of all the children who had grown up without their parents because of those organized lies. The DA continued, her voice firm but compassionate. "I will immediately begin the process of reviewing all these cases, but I need to be honest with you, this will take time, months probably. Each case needs to be re-evaluated individually. Witnesses need to be heard again without coercion. New evidence needs to be examined. She turned to the fugitive with a serious expression. You are a fugitive. I can't simply release you. You will need to remain in protective custody until your innocence is officially recognized by the judicial system. It will be different from a regular prison, more of a protective location, but you still won't have total freedom. The fugitive swallowed hard. More time locked up, even in better conditions. More time away from her daughter. But at least now there was a path, a light at the end of the tunnel that had previously seemed infinite. The injured woman would also be affected. The DA explained that she would need to testify in all the trials, face endless interrogations, undergo psychological evaluations to establish her credibility. She would be temporarily suspended from the force, while internal investigations determined if there were more people involved beyond those already identified. In the following days, as the bureaucracy slowly began to move, the fugitive was transferred to a witness protection house. The place was simple but clean, and ordinary residents converted into a temporary shelter. For the first time in over a year, she was able to take a real hot shower, feeling the clean water wash away layers of dirt, fear, and despair. There were clean clothes in her room, a real bed with fresh sheets, 3 meals served daily. She cried as she bit into the first piece of warm bread, as she tasted properly seasoned food, as she didn't have to rummage through trash or beg for scraps. Simple things that free people considered normal seemed like unimaginable luxuries. The injured woman faced her own private hell. The interrogations were exhausting, lasting hours, repeating the same questions in different ways to test the consistency of her answers. Some investigators treated her with respect, others with barely disguised suspicion, questioning her motives, insinuating that perhaps she herself was involved in the corruption and was now trying to save herself. The psychological evaluations were even worse. Professionals with neutral appearances asked invasive questions about her mental health, her history, her motivations. They wanted to know why she hadn't reported it before, why she had investigated alone, if she had anything to gain personally by exposing her colleagues. Each session left her exhausted and questioning her own decisions. She lost the apartment she rented, unable to pay the rent without a salary. Her few belongings were hastily packed and taken to a tiny room in the back of her 60-year-old mother's house. The elderly woman tried to hide her disappointment, but her tired eyes showed the weight of having a daughter who betrayed the force, even if for noble reasons. Former colleagues avoided her on the streets. Some openly cursed her, calling her a traitor, a snitch, someone who didn't understand the code of loyalty among cops. She lost sleep, relived the accident constantly, wondered if it had been worth destroying her own life to seek justice. Meanwhile, in the safe house, the fugitive finally received authorization to have contact with the sister who was taking care of her daughter. The bureaucratic process took 3 agonizing weeks, but a supervised visit was finally scheduled. When the door opened and her sister entered holding the hand of a small and frighteningly thin child, the fugitive felt the world stop. The 4-year-old girl seemed only 2 due to emotional malnutrition, her eyes too big for her small face, her fragile body hidden inside a worn dress. The child looked at her without immediate recognition. 15 months was an eternity in the life of someone so small. The fugitive knelt slowly, trying to control the tears that threatened to overflow, and opened her trembling arms. "It's me, honey. It's Mommy." The girl shrank behind her aunt's leg, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. The rejection hurt more than anything the fugitive had endured during her escape. Her own daughter didn't recognize her, was afraid of her, saw her as a stranger. The visit lasted 2 hours that seemed both infinite and too short. The fugitive sat on the cold floor of the room, playing slowly with simple toys provided by the house, trying to regain her daughter's trust inch by inch. The girl approached little by little, still hesitant, still scared. When it was time to leave, the child had finally sat next to her, letting her mother touch her thin, unkempt hair. It wasn't a hug. It wasn't the reunion of dreams, but it was a start. And when her sister took the girl away, the fugitive collapsed on the empty floor, sobbing so violently that the house staff had to come to her aid. The months dragged on with torturous slowness. It had been 4 months since the evidence was delivered to the district attorney, and the legal process moved like cold molasses. Hearings were scheduled and rescheduled. Witnesses disappeared temporarily or changed their testimonies under pressure from forces that still operated in the shadows. The injured woman visited the fugitive whenever possible, bringing news from the outside world. She told about the sensational headlines that began to appear in the local newspapers when the story leaked to the press. Police corruption ring exposed. Sheriff accused of fabricating evidence. 17 innocents may have been wrongfully convicted. Public pressure grew, and with it the urgency to resolve the cases quickly. But the judicial system had its own rhythms, its own rules, and didn't accelerate easily even in the face of scandal. During this period, something remarkable happened. The sheriff, fearing imminent arrest, tried to flee the country. He was arrested at the border, his bags loaded with absurd amounts of cash, partly in reals, partly in dollars, partly in euros. The seizure made national headlines, and the sight of that uniformed man being led away in handcuffs seemed to open the floodgates. Others involved began to confess, trying to negotiate reduced sentences in exchange for information. Accusations multiplied, each revealing new details of the operation that had lasted for years. Names of business owners who paid bribes surfaced, illegal operations were exposed, a complete map of local corruption was drawn before the investigators. The injured woman was called to testify multiple times, her credibility finally being recognized after months of questioning. They offered her honors, public recognition for her courage, even mentioned possible promotions when everything was resolved. She refused everything politely, explaining that she could no longer wear that uniform, not after everything she had seen, everything she had lived through. Finally, in the 5th month, it was the fugitive's turn to testify. The hearing was scheduled for a rainy Tuesday, and she spent the night before unable to sleep, mentally rehearsing everything she needed to say, all the injustices that needed to be heard. The courtroom was packed. Journalists occupied the benches in the back. Cameras weren't allowed, but notepads filled with quickly scribbled words. The injured woman was present, sitting in the front rows, offering silent support with her presence. The judge was a man of approximately 60, with grey hair and a severe expression that was intimidating. But when his eyes landed on the fugitive, there was something different there. Not immediate judgment, but something that seemed like controlled compassion, a willingness to truly listen. The fugitive began to speak, her voice trembling at first, but gaining firmness as the words flowed. She told about the initial arrest, about the false evidence, about the witnesses who clearly lied but were believed anyway. She told about the unfair sentence, about the brutal separation from her young daughter, about the despair that led her to flee. She told about the months on the run, sleeping in filthy places, eating leftovers found in the trash, living with the constant terror of being captured and never seeing her daughter again. Her voice broke as she described the pain of being separated from the child, of knowing that the girl was growing up, believing that her mother had abandoned her, that she was a bad person. And then she told about that day on the rural highway, about the decision to help precisely someone who represented everything that terrified her, about the days caring for the injured woman, about the revelation that changed everything, about the choice to trust when every instinct screamed to run. The hearing lasted 7 hours. Lawyers asked questions, requested clarifications, tried to find inconsistencies in her story. But her story was solid because it was true, and the evidence documented by the injured woman supported every word she said. When she finally finished, exhausted and with her throat sore from so much talking, the judge called for a recess. The 2-hour wait seemed to last entire days. The fugitive remained seated on the hard bench, her hands intertwined so tightly that her fingers turned white. The judge returned with a solemn expression. The silence in the room was absolute when he began to speak, his grave voice echoing through the walls. He detailed the irregularities found in her original trial, pointed out each flaw, each manipulation, each lie that had been accepted as truth. And then, looking directly at her, he uttered the words she had been waiting to hear for 15 endless months. "Your conviction is overturned with immediate effect. This court recognizes your complete and total innocence. You are free." The fugitive couldn't process it initially. The words seemed to come from far away, passing through a dense fog. Free, innocent, recognized. Her body began to tremble uncontrollably, and then the tears came like a sudden flood. Years of pain and injustice finally finding release. The injured woman stood up from the bench and ran to her, ignoring the leg that still ached occasionally. The two hugged in the middle of the courtroom, crying openly while people around them applauded, a sound that started timid but grew until it filled the entire room. The judge also acquitted the injured woman of any wrongdoing in her conduct, publicly recognizing her courage in exposing the corruption, even knowing the personal risks involved. He offered her the possibility of returning to the force with a significant promotion, a formal recognition of her efforts. But she refused with a firm and clear voice. "I can't wear that uniform anymore, not after everything I've seen, everything I've discovered. I need to find another path." In the following days, as the bureaucracy processed her official release, the fugitive learned that she would receive financial compensation from the government for the wrongful imprisonment. It wasn't a large amount, it wasn't wealth, but it was enough to start over. Enough to rent a simple house, buy basic furniture, guarantee food on the table for a few months while she looked for work. She chose a small house on the outskirts of the state capital, away from the town where everything had happened, away from the bad memories. It had 2 tiny bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, a bathroom with noisy plumbing, but it had solid walls, a roof without leaks, and windows that let in the sunlight. When she was finally able to bring her daughter to live with her, after more weeks of bureaucratic processes and evaluations by social workers, the girl was still hesitant and scared. The first days were difficult, marked by nightly cries, nightmares, moments when the child asked for the aunt she knew better than her own mother, but the fugitive had infinite patience now. She woke up every time the girl cried, rocked her slowly, sang songs that she barely remembered from her own childhood. She prepared simple meals, let the child choose what she wanted to eat within the few available options. She played on the cold floor for hours, building towers with old boxes, drawing with cheap crayons on sheets of reused paper. Little by little, inch by inch, trust was being rebuilt. The girl began to smile occasionally, small, shy smiles that made her mother's heart overflow. She began to sleep better, to eat with more appetite, to gain weight and height that emotional malnutrition had stolen. The injured woman visited regularly, bringing small gifts when she could, offering company and support. She had found work as an instructor at a private academy that trained private security guards. It wasn't police work, but she could still use her experience to teach, to train people who might make better choices than many of the colleagues she had known. She taught about ethics, about integrity, about the importance of doing the right thing, even when it seemed easier to look the other way. She told her story to the students, some very young with dreams of making a difference, others older and cynical who needed to be reminded that there was still goodness in the world. The two women developed a deep friendship, forged in shared suffering and the joint struggle against injustices that seemed insurmountable. They met monthly at a simple bakery in the neighborhood, sharing reheated coffee and bread with butter while they talked about the ordinary lives they had finally managed to build. They weren't extraordinary lives. There was no sudden wealth, no fairy tale endings with castles and princes. But there was peace. There was the freedom to walk the streets without constant fear. There was the possibility of planning for the future, even if modestly. There were nights of sleep without nightmares of persecution. The girl, after 6 months living again with her mother, finally began to call her mommy naturally, without hesitation. The first time it happened, during an ordinary breakfast on a random Tuesday, the fugitive needed to leave the kitchen to cry in the bathroom, her hands covering her mouth to muffle the sobs of overwhelming joy. She got a job as a janitor at a public school in the neighborhood. The work was hard, the salary modest, but it was honest and allowed her to be close to her daughter, who would begin studying there next year. The other employees treated her with respect, without judgments, without condemning looks. The injured woman thrived too in her own way. Her students respected her. Some even sought her out for personal advice, seeing in her someone who truly understood the weight of making difficult choices. She had partially reconciled with her mother, who was slowly beginning to understand that her daughter was not a traitor, but a hero, even if in a story that no one expected. On a sunny autumn Saturday, the injured woman appeared at the small house carrying a poorly wrapped package. The 4-year-old girl, now visibly healthier with rosy cheeks and bright eyes, ran to the door with genuine enthusiasm. The gift was a brown teddy bear, nothing special, bought at a popular store downtown. But for the child, it was a precious treasure. She hugged it with disproportionate force, squeezing the toy against her thin chest, and for the first time since returning to live with her mother, gave a loud, clear laugh that echoed through the simple house. The fugitive and the injured woman exchanged glances, and didn't need words to share the moment. There, in that ordinary instant of a child playing with a cheap toy, was condensed the entire journey. All the suffering, all the struggle, all the impossible choices that had led them to that point. Watching the girl twirl around the small room, the teddy bear flying in her arms, both women understood something essential. The true secret revealed on that dusty rural highway wasn't in the documents about corruption, wasn't in the evidence that exposed uniformed criminals. It was in the choice of a desperate woman who decided to save a stranger when it would have been easier, safer to simply keep running. It was in the understanding that compassion, even in the darkest moments, even when everything indicates that you should choose only your own survival, can still sprout and grow. And that sometimes the most unlikely encounters, the connections formed at the bottom of the pit of despair, are exactly those that restore not only individual lives, but the very faith in humanity. The girl finally stopped spinning, dizzy and laughing, and ran to hug her mother and the woman who was visiting. Her small arms tried to wrap around both at the same time, and the teddy bear was squeezed between the 3 bodies in a clumsy but perfect hug. In that simple house on the outskirts, with its peeling walls and patched furniture, without wealth or luxury, without grand endings or public acknowledgments, 3 people whom the system had tried to break completely found something that no injustice had managed to destroy completely: the ability to start over, to rebuild, to choose hope even after everything. And as the afternoon sun entered through the clean windows, illuminating that imperfect hug, the fugitive closed her eyes and allowed herself to finally believe that she was safe, that she was home, that she didn't need to run anymore. The journey had been long and devastating, but finally, she was where she belonged, with her daughter in her arms and a future, even if modest, waiting to be lived one day at a time. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story, giving it a score from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.